So we're going to go out after, right?
Yeah.
Perfect.
I really like staying warm. I still have that pedal. I knew there was something I forgot to give you. It was the kids who pitched it. Yeah.
I'm going to introduce you. Testing. Hello.
Yeah, sounds good.
Can you hear me okay?
Wait, I'll turn you up. If you can keep talking.
Testing.
Yeah.
We good?
Yeah, perfect.
Excellent.
Everyone can hear?
Everyone can hear? Gorgeous. Okay. And Mo, are we good for the live stream?
Okay.
The only problem is going to be when I'm holding the book and the mic at the same time. I can hold it for you. I will sit here and I will be your microphone stand. Bless. That will work excellently. Hello, everyone. My name is Mary. I run Lighthouse Edinburgh's Radical Bookshop. And it is such a joy to be here tonight for the launch of Abortion, a History, and to have Mary Fissell over from the US for this particular launch. I'm going to introduce her, and then she's going to do a reading and talk a little bit about the book. And then to get you lot warmed up, I will ask some questions, and then you will have lots of chance to ask a question. If you are watching online, you also have a chance to ask a question. And I think that's all I need to say before I read your very impressive biography. Mary Fissell is a historian of medicine and an authority on the history of reproduction, particularly sex education and midwifery. She is a professor in the Department of the History of Medicine at Johns Hopkins University and was previously a visiting fellow at the University of Cambridge. She has held affiliations with the Wellcome Trust and taught at the University of Manchester. She is the author of Vernacular Bodies, The Politics of Reproduction in Early Modern England, among other works, and she has appeared on the BBC and in Vice, Slate, The Washington Post, and the New York Times. Mary is currently working with a producer and a director to develop a 4-part television series about the history of midwifery for the UK market. Would you please put your hands together to welcome Mary Fissell. So I understand the deal is while I talk, I have the mask off so that we have better quality sound. So I hope everyone's peaceful with that. First of all, thank you so much for having me. It's a delight to be here. I do start with some thank yous. I try to remember it's not the Academy Awards and just kind of not overdo it, but a shout out to my agent, Amanda Annis, who believed in me from the get-go, to my editor, Emma Berry, who taught me how to write for a larger audience, which I'm very grateful for, and to you all for coming out tonight. It's a delight to share my work, so thank you so much for being here. I'm going to start by reading a little bit, and then I'll talk a little bit, since I'm the only one who's read the book in the room, except for you. I will talk a little bit about some of the choices that I made. Are we okay on sound at the back?
Perfect.
Great. I'm standing in a churchyard in South London. It's a cool, drizzly April day, and the wet green grass is spangled with tiny daisies. I have come here to mourn a woman who died many years ago. Her name was Eliza Wilson. The stone church with its graceful proportions and classical pillars still stands, but it has fallen on harder times. Like many London churches, it's locked during the week, and there are empty beer cans on the porch, despite signs forbidding the drinking of alcohol. In front is a slim bit of lawn, what is left of the churchyard where Wilson was buried. The graves were moved to a cemetery many decades ago. In Wilson's day, it was all open country around here. Now the church is squeezed onto a narrow triangle, with busy streets on either side and a railway line behind. The scrap of land looks like a miniature village green. In front of the church stand memorials to parishioners lost in the First and Second World Wars. Eliza Wilson died long before then, in 1848, after an abortion that went wrong. She was only 32. I had encountered Eliza in a Victorian newspaper while, of course, looking for something else. Her story is known to us because after her death, her midwife was put on trial. Every salacious detail was covered by the newspapers. But before that, Eliza was an ordinary young woman, working as a seamstress. She lived with her father and sisters in Norwood, a village south of London that was being swallowed up by the metropolis. Like so many others, they were migrants to the capital. They'd come from the Lake District way up north. In truth, I'm not entirely sure why I needed to come here to mourn someone I never knew. But historians bear witness, and I wanted to remember Wilson here where she lived. This book tells the stories of Eliza Wilson and other women like her who sought to end pregnancies in the past. Wilson's was the first abortion I researched, and I was stunned by the depth of detail hidden in the many column inches dedicated to her case. It was striking in part because she was so ordinary. Dressmaking was one of the most common occupations for working class women in 19th century Britain. Her decision to end her pregnancy was ordinary also. Some women like Wilson were unlucky. She lived in a time before antibiotics and died from an infection. Countless others survived. Their success in managing their reproductive lives makes them almost invisible in the historical record, but their decisions can echo in our imaginations. They remind us that abortion has long been an option for women, as far back in the historical record as we can see. So I want to say right now that I'm saying women, but if I were talking about today, we know the world isn't a simple binary male-female. I would say pregnant people today. But a part of my argument is that abortion restriction is often a form of gender backlash. And so it matters in the past that it was women or people identified as women who got pregnant and who sought abortions. So I say women when I'm talking about the past. So
I will give you that. I'll let you fire away.
okay. So, of course, I'm the only person here, like I said, who's read the book, except for you, Mary. And so I wanted to say a little bit about like how I thought about putting it together, why it looks the way it does. So one of the things you're probably wondering is why the long view. I go from the 4th century BCE all the way up to 1973, the crucial Roe v. Wade ruling in the United States that legalized abortion across all 50 states. And partly I do it because as a professor in America, we routinely teach survey courses. So every other autumn, I teach the history of medicine from antiquity to 1700. So I'm a little less scared to do a really long time period. But also, as I thought about it, it became clear, and as I began researching, that the long view brings us things that we wouldn't get another way. The first of those I already mentioned. Women have ended pregnancies for as long as we can see, like forever. I can't say that often enough in America today. It's really important for us to understand. Second, prohibition never works. It never works. It doesn't make it stop. It makes it more difficult, more dangerous. It raises questions of access, but it doesn't stop it. What I found, which surprised me, was that even when it's technically illegal, there are very long periods of toleration. These are times when people look away. They don't ask awkward questions. They pretend they don't see. They basically prioritize the health and well-being of an individual woman over the letter of the law. And much of the past has been that. Much of the past. Didn't expect that when I started. And finally, like I said, the long view shows us the kind of alternation between these periods of toleration or out and out, like it's legal, with these intense moments of restriction, like I'm living in the United States right now, where things hot up and restriction is there. It's related to gender backlash. So often, women have made some kind of gains in autonomy, and conservatives try to bend the arc of history back again. And that's what it's about. Sometimes it's as if abortion is just a symbol. It's not even the thing itself. It's just a way of trying to control women. So that's why I think the long view works and why it affords things that a more short view wouldn't afford. So the other thing I was going to talk about in terms of the structure of the book, there's 7 chapters, and each chapter is kind of hooked around the story of an individual woman. And I chose to do that because I believe that this is an issue of hearts, not minds. And if I want to change people's minds, change people's hearts, stories is the way to go. It's also because I want to normalize abortion. It's just a kind of healthcare. It's ordinary. And so there are many different kinds of women. I carefully thought about which women, which chapter. I will say, once I found the woman, it was like the chapter came to life for me. It's like when you have a really wrinkly piece of cloth and you shake it out and all of a sudden it's nice and flat. That was what finding the woman for the chapter was like. Suddenly I saw my way. It was organized and clear. But I want to make it clear that abortion is woven into the fabric of reproductive life. And it happens in different ways in different women's lives at different times. And that the rule is show, don't tell. And by inviting readers to understand these women's lives, even when it required acts of imagination, that was the way to go. So that's kind of why I wrote the book in the way that I did. And now I really welcome questions. We can start with, I know you have questions, but Amy, this is about conversation.
That was so smooth. Can we start with the women? So can I ask you to maybe pull out 1 or 2 of the women in the book, because this is a very different way of reading an abortion history. For me, having read many books around abortion, it's usually around the laws, who was making the laws when. This is about the women and how they were doing it and what that experience of abortion was for them, either as the people who were performing them or as the people who were seeking them. Can you maybe pick out 1 or 2 of the women in the book and what they meant to you?
Oh, I'd love to. How long do you have? I immediately think of 2. The early modern chapter, and I am an early modern historian by training, is about the woman named Anna Harding. And I was stunned to find her. I found her in another historian's work, and he generously shared information more than was in his published work with me. Really grateful to him. So Anna Harding worked as basically a menstrual regulator in early 17th century German. It's barely even a town. It's kind of a big village. By that I mean, flow too heavy? She had some herbs for that. It didn't come back on time? She had some herbs for that too. And I just didn't know somebody could even do that as an occupation. And I study this stuff. So I was like, wait, what? That's amazing. She also, when the butcher's wife got tired of her husband's frequent sexual needs, she had herb for that too. He was impotent for a while. But there's a darker side to her story. She did the usual things as a young woman, got married, had a son. In her early 40s, her husband gets really sick. He's sick for 6 months, and then he dies, and there's no money left because they've been trying to heal him. And she takes up sex work because there's really little else she can do. First client, local priest, just saying. And I think that's when she develops this other specialty of healing. And she took care of babies, women, this whole reproductive kind of area was hers. And the reason I know about her is terrible. It's because she was a witch. She wasn't a witch, of course. She was not a witch. But she was caught up in a witch panic in her village. These happened. They were terrible. They came along and all of a sudden, over a course of months, 100 people might be interrogated. And she kept insisting that the healing she did wasn't magical. And I don't think she thought it was magical. I don't think anyone in the town thought it was magical. She just had a specialized kind of knowledge. And none of that would do for the interrogators. That's not how those witch trials worked. And she was executed. And that was really hard for me to write about. She was 64, which was the age I was when I was writing that chapter. And I really felt it. I really felt it. She had done so much. And she had figured out a way to kind of keep body and soul together. It wasn't pretty, but she must have been a really captivating woman because she was still doing sex work in her early 60s. And the men that were her clients were clearly the big guys in town because the interrogator wrote, like, these names will not be recorded. Like, I get it. So that was really hard. A sort of happier story was the Baltimore one. So my last chapter is about 1940s and 50s Baltimore, where I live. And I've never done 20th century stuff. One of my colleagues, Graham Mooney, gifted me some newspaper clippings of an abortion trial. This is years ago, and that kind of piqued my interest. He said, I thought you'd be interested in this. I was like, yeah, very interesting. I started digging around, and I came across this woman who I refer to as Beatrice J, which is just her last initial, because there's a lot of debate in the field about like whether you name people or not. My feeling is if it would have been shameful in her lifetime, in the 1940s and 50s, then I had to respect that and not out her. That's just how I feel. I understand the other arguments. And she learned how to do a self-managed abortion in 1940, and then she did it again in 1951, at which point she had 4 children, and she was leaving her husband to be with another man. And a local pharmacist, where she had bought the supplies, said, hey, B, can you help me out? I got a lot of girls coming and asking me for stuff. Literally, like that's his words. And so she started doing extremely small-scale abortion provision. And then she was caught in a sting. Like, it was a period of immense crackdown, 40s and 50s. Police women, like, they go through this whole thing, marked bills, like, stakeout on the apartment. And, like, she never intended to be an abortion provider. But this kind of neighbor-to-neighbor practice, like, we don't know how common it was. It's totally a fluke I know about her at all. And actually, I'm as interested in the police woman that does the sting as I am in her. Mm-hmm. But when she went on trial, she got lucky. Mm-hmm. Because her lawyer made the point that the police woman, who literally was like on the kitchen table getting ready, the police woman wasn't pregnant. So if she wasn't pregnant, then it couldn't have been an attempted abortion, could it? Like, and it worked. She walked free. Mm-hmm. And the pharmacist who was her accomplice walked free. And she lived all the way past 1973. Like, she lived to a ripe old age, like experiencing the whole kind of gamut of change in abortion. And I found her story hopeful. Mm-hmm. Like, women helping women, like that, courageous. You know, this was a woman who decided what she wanted and went for it. And it was really meaningful to work on the place I live. Like, when I did my Baltimore bookstore event last week, I was 2 blocks from where she and her husband had lived. Mm-hmm. And that meant something to me. Like, I realized when I took my son to high school, when I drove him to high school, I drove past the office, or where had been the office of Baltimore's major physician provider, arrested in the early 50s. And it gave my landscape a completely different meaning for me. I want to think harder about that, but it had real meaning for me. So those are the 2 I think right away we'll talk about.
There's something about the way the book is written that has those stories come so alive that feel like a very familiar geography, like women that we've all known or been. And so I wonder, because it feels both deeply personal and also so thoroughly researched, how did this particular book come to be?
Oh, that's a lovely question. As usual, there's a good measure of happenstance. So I had been working on a scholarly book, and I'd gotten an agent for that because it's about sex, and I'm like, oh, sex sells. Let's do this. And you know, we're still in the kind of end. Like, I shouldn't say end. We're still in a pandemic time when I got the agent on Zoom, etc. First time I meet her outside, right? Because it's that time. We're sitting in a park, and she says, "Don't like to suggest, but have you ever thought about writing about the history of abortion?" I said, "Funny you should ask." I have. I teach this like one afternoon in the School of Public Health. They have an 8-week abortion as a public health issue class, and I teach like the history afternoon. And I started playing around with like what happened when you went way back, in as much as in, you know, an afternoon you could talk about that. And this was like March 2022. And I like to joke that for women of my generation, you know, we could see what was probably coming. And I used to joke that, like, I was going to spend my declining years driving women across state lines to get the care they needed, because, like, that was where we were going. But actually, I'm a really bad driver. Like, really not great. And I hate it. I'm a much better writer. And so this is my work. I'm not driving women across state lines at the moment. I'm writing. And when my agent sort of said, have you ever thought? And I said, well, actually I have. It somehow galvanized something in me, and I wrote a book proposal, like lickety-quickety, and I had a sabbatical that coming year, and I just wrote like crazy. And I mean, I have the benefit of the scholarship of many scholars, at least one of whom is in the room tonight. Thank you so much. And so I would go to the library, and it was still pandemic times. I'd have to order the books and pick them up in paper bags. So I'd get like 12 books a week. I kid you not. And I'd like read them like a maniac and pick out the stuff that mattered. And then I'd go read the primary sources, totally unlike how you normally do research as a historian. But I'd read enough to know what the story had to be for a chapter, like what the themes were. And I didn't see all the themes coming by a long shot. But then I would start looking into the primary sources and engaging with stories and sort of write my way through a chapter that way. Again, very different, but incredibly energizing. I actually really enjoyed the writing process. Very, very different, but I mean, I have to feel like I was just like sort of hoovering up vast amounts of information in order to figure out what was going on, but I don't know, it just happened. I could do it, so.
It works.
Exactly, it works.
On the research, I think as somebody who doesn't have an academic background, I found it amazing how much it is possible to infer from the silences when you know what you're looking for. And so things like being able to explain how familiar abortion would have been because there were jokes about abortion in plays that the average viewer would have got the joke. And that had never occurred to me. And there's so many other bits, especially when you go way back, where you're filling in the gaps because, as you say, like these women, we don't find out about them. They're not in the record unless something terrible happened, unless they end up being prosecuted or on trial or they've died. And this is really a book about all the other women. So I wonder, can you tell us a bit more about the research process? Like what was that like maybe for different eras? Was it different for different eras?
Well, the first thing, I was so surprised by how much was out there. Like, I literally didn't know that. How cheeky. I write this book proposal, right? I get it accepted. I sign a contract. And then I find out that there's just so much out there. And so it's a combination of things. You highlighted one thing that's really important, and that's the role of imagination. Often in the book I say, perhaps she felt this, or something like that. Because I can't presume to know. That would be like, no, you don't do that. But unless we exercise our imaginations, unless we wonder, we're not going to understand what it might have been like in the past. And I think that exercise is really important. Maybe we get it wrong, we'll never know. But beginning to have some empathy, some understanding, I think that is really important. And actually, I was thinking about this the other day. My first work as a historian of medicine was to work on the history of the patient, not the doctor. And I would always argue, like, if you read the doctor's notes really carefully, you're going to be able to see the patient in there. And your job is to take that and reconstitute the patient out of those notes. And so in some senses, I've always been doing that. I've been like, okay, but what would it look like from the other side? Let us just imagine how that would have looked. And it's imperfect, but like, these women weren't writing anything down. It's what we have. And I consider that active imagination for a historian is a really important tool. You can't go crazy with it, but it's a really important tool, and it matters.
If we go way back to the beginning, I had many a chuckle through the Greeks, the Romans, and I'd not really thought about abortion in the Roman era before. There's so many others that are eras that are so much more familiar and closer to home. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why that backlash against abortion happened, from it being relatively unstigmatized through periods of the Greeks to being a clampdown.
Sure, because it came as a surprise to me too. I didn't know that. So again, as was just said, in ancient Greece, abortion is not stigmatized. The Hippocratic corpus is full of recipes that could potentially would disrupt a cycle, bring it back, bring on a late period, provide an early abortion, etc. They also knew about surgical abortion in the very dangerous case of an incomplete miscarriage. something that is literally killing women in the United States today, when we have known what to do about that since the 4th century BCE. I mean, don't get me started, I'll just start going incandescent. But that's important. Like, abortion has been healthcare since forever. Now I got off track. Where was I? Oh, Rome. So ancient Greece, unstigmatized, it's perfectly sort of ordinary, jokes and plays, etc. And then in the early years of the Roman Empire, it seems that abortion took on a new meaning. Here's what was going on. Roman women appear to have exercised slightly greater freedoms than their foremothers had. And one of the things men complained about, elite men, was that elite women were driving around the city in coaches as they pleased. Oh no. And there's these whole set of scurrilous rumors that go through writers like Juvenal that these women, they're so vain, they're having affairs, they're so vain that they don't want their figures to change, so they abort. They abort to cover up this affair that they're having. And I have to say, the more I read, and what goes along with this is an increasingly pro-natalist policy by the empire, because they're concerned that elites are not having enough children to man the vast outposts of empire fundamentally, that they need more elite reproduction. And for example, the emperor outlaws adultery. Good luck with that, mate. That kind of thing. And what I was so struck by was the element of male fantasy in all of this. That how would they know any of this? I mean, one of them goes on this nostalgia kick and basically says oh, for the sturdy women of my mother's generation who never would have done anything like this. I'm like, how would you know your mother's intimate reproductive history, dude? Call me cynical. But the more I read, the more it seemed like this was a perfect example of the kind of gender backlash that I began to see. There's this weird echo of that for me in America in the 1850s and 60s, the beginnings of the first American anti-abortion movement. And it's the same kinds of complaints. The same kinds of complaints. Women are demanding the vote. They're spearheading the temperance movement, arguing that men are drinking away the wages that should be feeding the family. They're arguing for abolition. They're giving lectures on physiology to other women so they understand their bodies better. They're becoming physicians. And guess what? Male physicians don't like that. And it becomes part of this kind of clawback. And again, abortion is serving as a symbol as much as a reality, I think, in that. There's also the American situation. There's also the kind of horrible, the wrong people are having too many babies argument, which seems to never go out of fashion in America. So there's other elements in there. But this kind of Roman story, and Americans were classically trained, so many of them. I've often wondered, didn't anybody hear the echoes there? I've never read anybody that saw the echoes or heard them, but it struck me often.
I think one of the things that struck me in the book was this sense that men will always find a really good reason for abortion to be, where it becomes a threat to either patriarchy or racial capitalism. There will be a really good reason for why it has to be done. But it hasn't always been the same reasons that have been given. And I think I was really struck as someone who was raised a Catholic, there are different moments in history, whether that's in early Christendom, with Saint Bridget,
Yeah, Bridget.
who I loved, and you should tell us more about. And then later on, in the colonies and around the enslavement of peoples, that suddenly it reared its head for other reasons and therefore was explained as a scourge for other reasons. Can you talk a little bit maybe about those two eras and why abortion then was either not such a big deal or became a really big deal?
Sure, and I think one of the most important messages of the book is it's not usually about the fetus. Because if you live in America today and you hear the endless rhetoric about the unborn child, et cetera, you would imagine that that's the important part, and it's always been the important part, but it hasn't, hardly at all. So the early Christian church was extremely divided about abortions, how much of a sin it might be. There's a wide range of opinions. This isn't what the Catholic Church would tell you today, but there was. And it doesn't really get codified until the High Middle Ages, like the 1100s. When, I mean, what they're concerned about is ensoulment. How do you feel when a fetus gets ensouled? Like, it's ineffable. How would you know? And like, they're not going to know. So they finally decide that, for complicated reasons we won't go all into, that when, at the moment of quickening, which is when a person feels a fetus first move within them, that's going to be a proxy for ensoulment. And that abortion after that's a really bad sin. Abortion before that, it's not good, but it's really not that bad. And it's not until 1869, that it becomes like wrong at all stages. There's a brief moment earlier where like for 3 years, but that goes away. So really, it's a really long time. So Bridget of Kildare, holy woman in Ireland, born in the late 4th century. If there's anybody listening, tell me I'm wrong. Maybe 5th century. I should remember this. At any rate, she is a holy woman. She's like a nun. It's not as formal. It's not like the convents that you're imagining. Lives in community. One of the young women who's there, who will become part of the community, forgets herself and has sexual relations with a young man. She gets pregnant. Uh-oh. Belly begins to swell. And Bridget puts her hand on the belly, and the pregnancy is gone as if it never had been. So think about that. A saint of the church is ending a pregnancy. That's remarkable. But the other spin I want to put on that is that it's listed in her miracles. And why is it a miracle? Because it was instant. Irish women knew about herbs that they could have taken to end an early pregnancy. But that would have meant a couple of days of cramps and bleeding. That's not a miracle. It's just medicine. But happening all at once like that, that's a miracle. And this is in her, it's in her vita, her life, that would have been read aloud to people. So that's a very different church than the one we imagine today. And so what's wrong is really about ensoulment, but it takes a long time for that to actually become codified. The other side of the story about racial capitalism is something that I didn't fully anticipate when I started writing the book. And that is the way that I had long felt, and this is really feel, not know, that to talk about abortion in the United States was always already to talk about race. That was like woven in because of the long histories both of enslavement and of eugenics, cast very long shadows. But as I began to work more, and I realized the incredibly rich history that we can access, both of enslaved women in the Caribbean and then in the American South, I was like, wow, this is like much more than I knew. This is a really important history. And there, of course, what's wrong, and I use those scare quotes, I mean those scare quotes, what's wrong about abortion is that these women are not giving birth to more capital, right? They're not giving birth to beings who will be entered in the ledger book. And there's a lot of fear on the part of planters that women are secretly aborting as a mode of resistance. Now, it's really hard to find that out because those women weren't writing this down. But in the 1930s, the Works Progress Administration, in the height of the Depression, hired writers to go out and interview people, including people who had been born in slavery. And there's fascinating, brief, ephemeral testimony there to a practice that took my breath away, which was that women chewed cotton root as a way of either not getting pregnant or ending a pregnancy. Think about that for a moment. Cotton root, the root of the plant that they labored in the hot fields to plant, hoe, tend, and harvest, that enriched their enslavers. By night, they chewed the root as a mode of resistance. I mean, that's poetic. You couldn't write that, right? And what I really liked, this little detail, I'm reading the WPA narratives, and I'm realizing that there's botanical knowledge that those women had, that the white doctors who started to figure it out didn't seem to know. One of the women said, so you get a cotton plant, you plant it under your quarters where nobody will see it. And it's not effective until it's bloomed once. It has to have at least one flower, and then that will be effective. Meanwhile, white physicians in the South are starting to write about this. They're starting to like figure it out. And by the 1860s, you can buy like extract of cotton root in Boston in a pharmacy. I never saw them say the thing about the flower, not once. And I'm fascinated by that. It suggests a kind of botanical expertise that originally came with those people from Africa, because cotton root as a fertility regulator is African, and it comes forced to come to the Americas. What a story, right? But there, the issue is not about the fetus as the fetus, or about ensoulment, or any of that, or about illicit sex, which is so often the problem that abortion gets linked to in that period. It's about production and racial capitalism.
Yeah, and then in other eras, I can't remember which one. Might have been the Greeks or the Romans. The idea that if you somebody accidentally made your wife miscarry, that really you were damaging the husband's property, and so the issue was the property within her that would be the future heir, not the fetus, not the wife.
Exactly, it's about husband's property. Well, I mean, in some ways, that's the heart of Exodus. It's about the harm to the woman and the husband's property in the woman. But that's also the case for some of the logic in ancient Rome. Like, how dare you touch what's mine? That's mine. You can't mess with that. So, yeah.
I find it kind of galvanizing. It's like they will always find a new way or a new reason, and we've just got to be slippier than they are. I have a million questions, but I'm sure that you have questions too, and that there may be some questions online. By the way, if we're a little quiet, let us know in the chat. Does anyone have a question in the room? Yeah?
Hi.
Can you hear me? Is this okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi. Thank you so much for being here. I'm actually unfortunately a medical student in America.
Oh.
So this speaks volumes to what's going on right now, and I've heard from him. He's actually a physician there, and he's told me many stories where physicians can actually turn down cases of abortion. And as like a medical student there, I just want to be like fully prepared for what's to come and how to go about,